Hello everyone, I am Beth Golden, and today we're going to talk about ink and ink pads and the different kinds. There is so much out there. This is just the ones that I use the most of, and this isn't even all of them. And so I thought it would probably be a good idea just to talk about ink because I get a lot of questions that can be answered by the type of ink that you are using on your projects. So we're going to go over the most common inks out there, and they're in a slew of different brands. I will share with you the ones that I personally buy and like. However, that doesn't mean that another brand won't do it. If it's the same type ink, it's going to be the same across the board. You may have a little bit of a difference with your pads, the ink pads themselves, but universally there's only a couple different or several inks out there that are made. So I'm going to talk to you about what each of them are, when you want to use them, and it's pretty basic on how to use them. If I need further explanation, I will tell you. So the first kind of ink there is, I think, that everybody needs that's a surefire is a StazOn ink. This is a water fast drying solvent ink. It's waterproof, I should say. This can be used on porous and non-porous surfaces. So you can use this on like glass or acrylic or an acetate sheet. You also can use it on paper. This is good on paper if you want to use a wet medium with it, not an alcohol-based medium. You don't want to use alcohol markers with this because you do have the potential of ruining your alcohol marker, and nobody wants to make that mistake. I do have a video out in which I talk about ink pads that are suitable for alcohol markers. And basically there's one out that I trust exclusively for that, but StazOn, it's questionable. Like, you don't want to use just a waterproof ink pad for that. You want to use a specific pad because that is a question that I get a lot of. So this can be used with watercolor pencils. That's a good one for this one if you're on paper. Also, you can use this on glossy paper. Foiled paper. Okay, so this is a good waterproof one. I like it in black. I don't do the color crazy stuff for general stamping. I save that for, backgrounds and stuff. So you only need this, in my opinion, in black. All right, and then the next up is, now we're going to talk about the one that is safe, universally safe for alcohol markers, and that is Memento. You can get this puppy at Hobby Lobby, all right? Go in, use your 40, I think you can get StazOn too. I know they carry this. It's right there with their stamps. This is a great ink, fairly universal, not waterproof, but it does work with alcohol ink. So if you want to get into Copic markers, by all means, this is a must. Again, you only really need it in black, especially if you're coloring. You don't need to have this in every color under the rainbow because you're coloring. You just need the lines, right? At least that's the way I think. I like to take this opportunity real quick to do my commercial for my channel. I have to make it kind of humorous at this point, you guys, because if I don't say it for my new people that are here, they may not know. But anyway, if you have not subscribed to my channel, I certainly hope that you do so. Also, hit that notification bell. That way it'll alert you whenever I have a video that's coming out. If you have any questions or comments, please make sure you leave them down below. This one actually is super important to me because I really do like to interact with you guys. It's super important that we build a sense of community, and I'm all about fostering that. So if you have any questions, please leave them down below. Suggestions, leave them down below. Let's all share, okay? And I always try to get back to you guys whenever you have a question. And if I don't know the answer, I will try to steer you in the direction so you can find one. I don't always respond to hateful comments, but I will say thank you for your comment because it does help keep my video in circulation. So I even appreciate those. So thank you for those as well. And then the other thing is if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you feel so inclined to share, that would be awesome. YouTube really likes it when things are shared. I love it when it's shared because it helps get things in circulation. And when my videos are out circulating, getting more views, that means I can continue to bring you free content over here on YouTube and not have to go to a paid platform like Patreon. So I really want to keep it free, and I need everybody's help in doing that if you are enjoying these videos. All right, that's all. We can get back to this. Okay, so the Memento, this one is good for your Copic markers or alcohol markers. Okay, so next up, I want to talk about a dye and a pigment ink, okay? Actually, no, let me back up. Archival ink. This, you guys, these work pretty much with any product by Ranger. This is a acid-free, permanent, waterproof ink. You can use this with your watercolor pencils, your distress markers. You can even use it with other dye inks. You can use it with distress ink and distress oxides. I'm not going to get into distress inks and distress oxides right now. I have other videos out there. I'm just talking about the basics, and those kind of are not basic inks that every crafter uses. Well, I mean, I don't know if that makes any sense. They're important, but they're in a category all on their own. Okay, so I do have videos on that. Distress archival inks are wonderful because you can actually use them as well on acetate. Same thing you can use is StazOn ink. In fact, let's be real. I kind of think, I can't say that. You can make the connection, okay? I'm not sure if it's the same type general. I know that Archival, though, is safe for your memory keeping and things like that. So these are my little collection I have, and I use them a lot. Plus, I love the pads on these because they are small enough to store the little cubes, and I can ink my edges of my paper, which I love to do. So these are really wonderful. All right, next up, let's talk about pigment and dye ink, okay? I'm a big fan of dye ink because what it does, these are the dye inks that I use, okay? I have Catherine Pooler and Simon Hurley. I love their color palette, and I like dye ink. Dye ink basically dyes your paper. So if you take a dye ink and you stamp an image in a particular color, you can have it move a little bit with water, and you can blend it for some time. But once it fully dries, it gets a little bit harder to move around, but it still will move. And that's because it is dyeing the paper. It is soaking into the paper and changing the color of it. All right, kind of like when you tie-dye a shirt, think of it like that. The reason why I like these two brands is even though they behave fairly the same, their ink pads are very different. And this ink pad, see how that looks? All right, it's not as, not as juicy as this one, and there's a benefit to that. I can ink edges of paper with this. Plus, sometimes I don't want my stamp to get as saturated, and so I like Simon Hurley's ink pads. Plus, they blend beautifully. I don't get smudges. If I'm starting to blend with a Simon Hurley ink pad and I notice that I can see the mark, all I have to do is just keep working that, and it will work itself out. It's a buildable color. Catherine Pooler inks are wonderful for one tap. Basically, it's you tap your stamp once on it, and it gives you a beautiful image every time. And her ink pads are different than his. They're a little bit more squishy, okay? If that makes any sense. But, you know, I can't ink the edges because I'll get a pool of ink on the edge of my paper if I run it on my paper. Plus, her pads are a little bit easier to damage than Simon Hurley pads. So that's why I use these two inks. And again, This is a dye ink pad. You can emboss with it as long as it's still wet. However, you're not going to get a perfect emboss image on it. It's not going to be like the whole thing because some of it will have dried. So I don't recommend embossing for this. I mean, you can, but it's not my favorite because that ink does settle into the paper. So these are really fun for blending and things like that, but they're not going to be as movable as, say, a pigment ink. And we're going to talk about that next. And pigment inks are important. Okay, so as I drop it, this is a pigment ink. And actually, this is my favorite one to emboss with. The reason why a pigment ink is cool is because it's a pigment, so it sits on top of your paper. It does not soak down into your paper. So it is very movable. It never fully dries unless you do coat it with some embossing powder and heat set it. So this, I only use pigment ink when I want to heat set. I never ever use it on anything but paper either, because it just won't ever set up. You can remove it. So I guess if you want to stamp something on, an acrylic block or whatever, you can, and then you can remove it later. I don't know. I've never done that, but that's what it is. Pigment ink is important, but it moves. And it's what you would use for embossing with. And it's a very rich, vibrant color that never soaks into the paper. That's the difference. And then we have the embossing pad. And it's created for embossing, but really the difference is there's just no pigment in it. There's no color in it. It's just the embossing liquid. So you can emboss with both. Now, something that you want to keep in mind that I have noticed about this, VersaFine Clear is the best, I think, on the market for embossing. However, I have discovered, depending on what medium I use to color in my image, the pigment underneath the embossing powder after I have heat set it, sometimes it doesn't always catch some of that powder, so that embossed image is not entirely embossed, if that makes any sense, and I can actually pull some of that color into my image as I'm coloring it with my, my water-based marker or my watercolor pencils. So that's something you want to be careful with. If you plan on coloring in your image, you're gonna want to go with a clear mark because there's no pigment. And when the embossing is fully embossed, it's a plastic, so it doesn't move. It's not water reactive, it's waterproof, it's just a plastic. So you want to just make sure you do this. The reason why I often go to this and not this is because really, I can't see it all the time. And I need to wear my glasses. So my biggest fear is that I'm gonna take an image that I really like on a piece of paper that isn't like the cheapest thing on the block, and I'm not gonna get the entire image stamped, and I'm not gonna notice until after I emboss it. And then it's going to be too late because it would be fuzzy or it wouldn't stamp properly because I have part of it embossed. So that's my own personal struggle. However, when I use my MISTI and I really, really ink up the stamp well, I've never had that. I think I've had that happen like once and it was my fault, but it's really like freaked me out. Okay. That's just my hang up. So I hope that you found this, good. Like, I hope you found beneficial, especially if you're confused on what inks are. I do think that it's important if you're just getting started in this. I highly recommend a waterproof ink, either a StazOn or an Archival ink would be good for that. Either one of these is great. Just start off with black. Okay. You can find both of these at your local craft store. So whatever, and you can even get this in a bigger one. I just like the little ones. So whatever is your preference, but you would be happy. You need at least one of those, either a StazOn or an Archival in black. Then the other one that I think you would want one in, if you're embossing, if you're not embossing, then just forget it. You don't need it. Would be a pigment black ink or a clear mark. That would be important. And again, think about it before you want to start embossing, you guys, because embossing, that's a whole other area of art. And like for me, if I'm going to emboss something, I'd rather do, it's like, what's going to take up less room? A colored embossable pad, which is like this, and just have a clear embossing powder on hand, or a clear embossing pad on hand with a slew of colors in embossing powders. Like, how do you want to do it? That's a question to ask yourself, if that makes any sense. All right. And then if you are a Copic marker fan or alcohol marker, you're going to need, definitely, you're going to want a Memento Tuxedo Black. Those are your basics right there. And then once you start to dive into color and you want to do layering and things like that, I really think that you cannot go wrong with Catherine Pooler and Simon Hurley, either or. I recommend both because I really pull both of them out depending on my project. And that just comes with experience and practice. You know, you'll figure that out as you go along. All right, you guys, I certainly hope that you found this video beneficial. Until next time, I'm Bets Golden. Happy crafting.